Gold digger discovers real love while healing her paralyzed husband. She'd signed the contract for $5 million and a clean exit in 2 years. No strings, no emotions, just a business transaction with a man who couldn't walk. But somewhere between the sterile hospital visits and the late-night confessions in his darkened bedroom, Naomi Clark realized she'd fallen for the one person she was never supposed to love, her paralyzed billionaire husband, Julian West. And now, with his life hanging by a thread and his family plotting to pull the plug, she'd have to choose between the money she desperately needed and the man she never meant to save. Before we dive into the main story, do not forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where you are watching from. The law office smelled like old leather and expensive lies. Naomi Clark sat in the high-backed chair across from Julian West's attorney, her fingers gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles had gone pale beneath her brown skin. The contract sat before her on the mahogany desk, 23 pages of legal jargon that all boiled down to one simple transaction. Marry a man she'd never met, stay for 2 years, and walk away with $5 million. $5 million. The number blazed in her mind like a neon sign, drowning out every other thought. $5 million would pay off her mother's medical debt. $5 million would cover the experimental treatment the insurance company had denied 3 times. $5 million meant her mother might actually live to see 60. Miss Clark. The attorney, a sharp-featured man named Gerald Stevens, slid a gold pen across the desk toward her. If you have any questions about the terms, now would be the time. Naomi forced herself to focus on his words instead of the desperate arithmetic running through her head. Let me make sure I understand, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I marry Mr. West, live in his home for 2 years, make public appearances as needed, and at the end of the term, we divorce quietly. I receive $5 million, and we both walk away. Precisely. Stevens adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. West requires a companion. Someone to manage his household, attend to his needs, and present a united front to his board of directors. His accident left him paralyzed from the waist down, and certain members of his family have been circling like vultures, questioning his capacity to run West Industries. So I'm what? A prop. Window dressing to make him look stable. You're a solution to a problem, Miss Clark. Just as Mr. West is a solution to yours. Stevens opened a folder and slid a photograph across the desk. Naomi's breath caught. The man in the photo was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with sharp cheekbones, intense gray eyes, and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd stopped caring about appearances. He sat in a sleek black wheelchair on what looked like a penthouse balcony, the Chicago skyline spread out behind him like a kingdom he no longer had the energy to rule. His jaw was set, his mouth a hard line, and his eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from losing everything that mattered. He was beautiful in the way broken things sometimes were, all sharp edges and dangerous surfaces. Julian West, Stevens said. 36 years old. CEO of West Industries, a multinational tech conglomerate worth approximately $40 billion. He was in a car accident 18 months ago. The impact severed his spinal cord at the L1 vertebra. He's been through 6 surgeries, countless rounds of physical therapy, and every experimental treatment money can buy. Nothing has worked. Naomi studied the photograph. There was something in Julian's eyes, not quite defeat, but close. Like he was still breathing but had forgotten why. Why me? She asked. There must be hundreds of women who'd jump at this opportunity. Mr. West has specific requirements. He wants someone who needs the money enough to honor the contract but isn't looking for a fairy tale. Someone practical. Someone who won't complicate things with expectations of romance or emotional entanglement. Stevens paused. Your financial situation makes you an ideal candidate. The debts from your mother's cancer treatment, the foreclosure notice on your apartment, the 3 jobs you're currently working, you need this money, Miss Clark. And you're smart enough not to confuse a business arrangement with love. The word should have stung, but Naomi had stopped believing in love around the same time she'd started measuring her life in medical bills and collection agency phone calls. Love was a luxury for people who could afford to be reckless with their hearts. She'd buried that version of herself 2 years ago when her mother's first diagnosis came back positive. What about intimacy? The question felt like glass in her throat. Stevens's expression didn't change. Not required. Mr. West's injury makes such activities complicated. You'll have separate bedrooms. Your primary responsibilities are household management and public appearances. Think of it as being a very well-paid personal assistant with a marriage license. Naomi looked at the contract again. The number at the bottom seemed to pulse. $5 million. She thought of her mother in that narrow hospital bed, her once vibrant skin gone ashen, her body eating itself from the inside out because they couldn't afford the treatment that might save her. She thought of the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, the maxed-out credit cards, the desperate late-night prayers to a God who seemed to have stopped listening. She thought of Julian West in his wheelchair, surrounded by billions of dollars and completely alone. Where do I sign? What would you do in Naomi's position? Would you marry a stranger for $5 million to save someone you love? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know if you think she's making the right choice. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a private ceremony at Julian's penthouse. Naomi wore a simple cream dress she'd bought at a department store, nothing fancy, because this wasn't that kind of wedding. No guests filled the rows of chairs that had been set up in the living room. No music played. No flowers decorated the space except for a single arrangement of white roses on the mantel that looked like they'd been ordered by someone who'd forgotten what joy looked like. Just Naomi, Julian, the officiant, and Gerald Stevens as witness. Julian sat in his wheelchair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Naomi had made in the last year, but it hung on him like he'd lost weight since it was tailored. His face was carefully blank, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. He hadn't looked directly at her once. The officiant, a bored-looking woman who'd clearly done this kind of transactional ceremony before, rushed through the vows. Naomi repeated the words in a voice that didn't sound like her own, agreeing to love and honor a man whose last name she'd only learned 3 weeks ago. When it came time to exchange rings, Julian's hands shook slightly as he slid the platinum band onto her finger. His skin was warm, his touch gentle, and for just a second, his eyes met hers. In that brief moment, Naomi saw something flicker in his gaze, not quite hope, but maybe curiosity. Like he was trying to figure out what kind of woman would agree to chain herself to a stranger's broken life for money. Then the moment passed, and his expression went blank again. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Julian's jaw tightened. He wheeled himself closer, and Naomi leaned down, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons she didn't want to examine. Their lips met for exactly 2 seconds, a dry, perfunctory press of skin against skin that meant nothing and everything. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and woodsy, and feel the tension radiating off him in waves. When she pulled back, his eyes were already closed. "Congratulations," the officiant said. "You're legally married." Stevens produced a bottle of champagne that no one drank. He handed Naomi a folder containing her new identification documents, credit cards with her married name, and keys to the penthouse. Then he left, and the officiant followed, and suddenly Naomi was alone with her husband in the cavernous space that was now supposed to be her home. Julian wheeled himself toward the hallway without a word. "Should we talk?" Naomi called after him. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Your room is the 3rd door on the left. There's a household staff schedule on your nightstand. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, comes Monday through Friday. Chef Raymond prepares meals according to dietary restrictions you'll find in the kitchen. My assistant, Patricia, will contact you about upcoming public appearances. If you need anything, use the intercom system." His voice was flat, completely devoid of emotion. Like he was reading from a manual titled How to Live with a Stranger You've Legally Bound Yourself to. "Julian, I prefer if we keep interactions to a minimum outside of necessary appearances," he said, still not looking at her. "You have your space. I have mine." This arrangement works best if we respect those boundaries. Then he wheeled himself down the hallway and disappeared into what she assumed was his bedroom. The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded like a slamming. Naomi stood in the living room, her living room now, technically, and tried to remember how to breathe. The space was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago, modern furniture in shades of gray and white, abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than most people's houses. Everything was pristine, perfectly arranged, completely sterile. It looked like a museum, not a home. A place where people existed but didn't actually live. She found her room exactly where Julian had indicated. Someone, probably the mysterious Mrs. Chen, had already unpacked her meager belongings. Her 5-year-old laptop sat on the desk. Her clothes hung in a walk-in closet that was roughly the size of her old apartment. Her mother's photo, the one from before the cancer, when her smile still reached her eyes, sat on the nightstand. Naomi picked up the frame, her thumb tracing the glass. "I did it, Mama," she whispered. "I got the money. You're going to be okay." Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother's nurse. "Treatment approved. Starting next week. Your mother is crying happy tears." Naomi sank onto the bed, a massive king-sized thing with sheets that probably had a thread count higher than her credit score, and let herself cry for the first time in weeks. Relief, guilt, exhaustion, and something else she couldn't name poured out of her in silent, shaking sobs. She'd saved her mother. She'd sold herself to do it. And somewhere down the hall, her husband sat alone in the dark, probably wondering what kind of desperate woman trades 2 years of her life for money. The first week passed in careful silence. Naomi learned the rhythm of the penthouse. Mrs. Chen arrived at 7 every morning, her presence announced by the quiet sounds of cleaning. Chef Raymond appeared at noon to prepare lunch and dinner, leaving covered plates in the refrigerator with reheating instructions. Patricia, Julian's assistant, a brisk woman in her 50s with perfect posture and zero patience for small talk, emailed Naomi a schedule of upcoming charity galas, board dinners, and public appearances where she'd need to play the role of devoted wife. Julian remained a ghost in his own home. She saw him mostly in passing, wheeling himself from his bedroom to his home office in the mornings, taking business calls in sharp, clipped tones that suggested West Industries was still very much under his control. Sometimes she'd hear the soft whir of his wheelchair at odd hours, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., moving through the penthouse like he couldn't sleep either. They'd exchange polite nods when their paths crossed. Nothing more. It should have been exactly what Naomi wanted, a clean, uncomplicated arrangement. But something about the silence felt wrong. She'd catch glimpses of Julian when he didn't know she was watching, the way his hands would grip the wheelchair rims until his knuckles went white, the deep lines of pain that would crease his forehead, the exhaustion in his eyes that suggested sleep was something he'd given up on. He was in pain. Constantly. And he was facing it completely alone. On the 8th day, Naomi decided to break the rules. She found Julian in his office late at night, surrounded by computer monitors displaying stock charts and financial reports. He'd shed his suit jacket, and his white dress shirt was rolled up at the sleeves. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. An empty coffee cup sat next to 3 prescription bottles. "You should eat something," Naomi said from the doorway. Julian's head snapped up, surprise flashing across his face before his usual mask slid back into place. "I'm fine." Chef Raymond left chicken marsala in the fridge. "It's actually pretty good." "I said I'm fine." But his hand was trembling as he reached for the mouse, and Naomi could see the tight lines of pain around his mouth. She'd seen that look before, on her mother's face during the bad days, when the cancer felt like it was eating her from the inside out. "When did you last take your pain medication?" she asked, moving into the room without invitation. "That's not your concern. We're married. Technically, your health is exactly my concern." She picked up one of the prescription bottles. "This says every 4 hours as needed. The timestamp is from 9 this morning. I don't like how they make me feel. Foggy. Useless. You won't be useful if you pass out from pain, Julian." He finally looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the wedding. His gray eyes were sharp despite the exhaustion, searching her face like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense. "Why do you care?" he asked quietly. "This is a job to you. I'm a job to you." The words hit harder than they should have. Maybe because they were partially true. Maybe because Naomi was starting to realize they were becoming less true every day. "I care because I'm not a complete monster," she said. "And because you look like you're about to shatter into 1,000 pieces." Something in his expression cracked. Just for a second, just enough for her to see the raw exhaustion underneath. Then he wheeled himself back from the desk, his jaw set. "I don't need your pity." "Good. Because I'm not offering it. I'm offering food and basic human decency." Huge difference. She thought he might argue, might order her out of his office and back behind the careful walls they'd constructed. Instead, he surprised her by nodding once, sharp and brief. "Fine. But you're eating too. I heard you skip lunch again." Naomi blinked. "You were paying attention?" "Mrs. Chen tells me things," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "She worries. Says you work too hard on those online courses, whatever you're studying." "Physical therapy certification," Naomi said before she could stop herself. "I started the program before everything. Figured I might as well finish it." Julian's expression shifted, something almost like interest crossing his features. "Physical therapy?" "I wanted to help people recover from injuries, rebuild their strength. It seemed important." She paused. Ironic, considering my current situation. For the first time since she'd met him, Julian West almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face from handsome to absolutely devastating. "Ironic," he agreed. "Or fate has a twisted sense of humor." They ate the chicken marsala in his office, sitting in companionable silence while Chicago glittered below them like a million broken promises trying to be stars. And when Naomi finally stood to leave, Julian's voice stopped her at the door. "Thank you." She turned. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something vulnerable and guarded at the same time. "For what?" "For not treating me like I'm already dead." The first charity gala happened 2 weeks into their marriage. Naomi stood in front of her closet mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The stylist Patricia had sent over had transformed her into someone who belonged on Julian's arm. Her natural hair was styled in elegant twists pinned up to showcase her shoulders, her makeup was flawless, and the emerald green gown hugged her curves in a way that felt both powerful and terrifying. Diamond earrings, on loan from some exclusive jeweler, caught the light every time she moved. She looked like money. Like she belonged in Julian West's world. But her hands were shaking as she fastened the delicate clasp of her bracelet. "You look beautiful." Naomi spun around. Julian sat in his wheelchair just outside her doorway, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo that made him look every inch the billionaire CEO. His dark hair was styled back, his gray eyes sharp and assessing as they traveled over her. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze, appreciation, maybe, or surprise, before his expression shuttered again. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Naomi said, trying to calm the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves about the gala. "The vultures will be circling tonight," Julian said, his voice taking on that flat, business-like tone she'd come to recognize as his armor. "My cousin Richard and his mother, my Aunt Catherine. They've been trying to convince the board that I'm not fit to run West Industries since the accident. Tonight is about showing them a united front, a man who's moved on with his life, not wallowing in self-pity." "Is that what you think you're doing? Wallowing?" His jaw tightened. "That's what they think I'm doing. What I actually feel doesn't matter." Naomi crossed the room and knelt down in front of his wheelchair, forcing him to meet her eyes. This close, she could see the faint scar along his temple from the accident, the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "We're going to walk, well, you're going to roll, into that gala with our heads high. You're going to show them exactly who Julian West is, A man who's still running a $40 billion company from a wheelchair, who's smarter than all of them combined, and who happens to have a wife who will smile so convincingly that no one will ever doubt this marriage is real. Understood. Something sparked in Julian's eyes, surprise mixed with something that looked almost like admiration. You're good at this. At what? Pretending to believe in me. I'm not pretending, Naomi said, and realized with a jolt that she meant it. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd watched him work 18-hour days, negotiate deals in 3 different time zones, and run his company with a precision that would have been impressive in any circumstances, but was extraordinary given everything he was dealing with. You're one of the most determined people I've ever met. Anyone who can't see that is an idiot. Julian studied her for a long moment, and Naomi felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. Then he reached out and touched her cheek, just his fingertips, feather-light against her skin. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle, that her breath caught. Thank you, he said quietly. For playing your part so well. Playing your part. Right. Because that's what this was. A performance. A transaction. So why did her skin burn where he'd touched her? The gala was held at the Four Seasons Hotel in a ballroom that screamed old money and older traditions. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across white marble floors. Women in designer gowns that cost more than cars drifted between clusters of men in tuxedos, their laughter sharp and practiced. A string quartet played something classical and boring in the corner. Naomi had been to exactly 0 events like this in her entire life. Her hand tightened on the back of Julian's wheelchair as they entered, and she felt him shift slightly beneath her touch, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that he knew she was nervous. Breathe, he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. You belong here as much as any of them. More, actually, since most of them inherited their money and did nothing to earn it. And you. I inherited mine too. But at least I've tripled it. There was a hint of dark humor in his voice that made Naomi's lips twitch despite her nerves. She was learning that Julian had a dry wit he kept carefully hidden, revealing it only in rare, unguarded moments. They made it approximately 30 seconds into the room before the vultures descended. Julian! What a surprise to see you out and about. A tall, silver-haired man with a smile like a shark materialized in front of them, accompanied by an elegant woman in her 60s wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country. Mother and I were just saying we didn't expect you to attend, given everything. Richard. Aunt Catherine. Julian's voice went cold enough to freeze vodka. May I introduce my wife, Naomi West. Naomi, this is my cousin Richard West and his mother, Catherine West. The way Julian said, my wife, sent an unexpected shiver down Naomi's spine. There was possession in those words, a claiming that went beyond their contract. Catherine's gaze swept over Naomi like she was evaluating livestock at auction. How unexpected. We had no idea Julian was seeing anyone, let alone seriously enough to marry. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The wedding was quite sudden, wasn't it? When you know, Naomi said smoothly, moving to stand beside Julian's wheelchair and resting her hand on his shoulder. She felt the tension in his muscles beneath her palm. Julian, and I didn't see the point in waiting. How modern, Catherine said. Her tone suggesting modern was synonymous with trashy. And what is it you do, dear? Before you became Mrs. West. The question was designed to cut. To highlight the class difference, to suggest that Naomi was a gold digger who'd trapped a vulnerable man. And maybe Catherine wasn't entirely wrong, but she didn't know the whole story, didn't understand the desperation that had brought Naomi to Julian's door. I was working 3 jobs while completing my physical therapy certification, Naomi said evenly. But I've put my career on hold to support my husband as he continues to run one of the most successful companies in the world. Someone has to make sure he doesn't work himself to death. She felt Julian's shoulder shift beneath her hand. Surprise, maybe, at how easily she'd flipped the narrative. Now she wasn't the gold digger. She was the devoted wife sacrificing her career for her husband. Richard's eyes narrowed. Speaking of the company, Julian, We need to discuss the merger proposal with Tecton Industries. The board has concerns about your focus. Perhaps it would be better to bring in additional leadership to help shoulder the burden. The board's concerns are noted and dismissed, Julian said coldly. My focus is exactly where it needs to be. The Tecton merger is a bad deal. They're overvalued by at least 30%, and their tech is 2 years behind ours. Anyone with basic financial literacy can see that. But the board doesn't vote on operational decisions. That's my job as CEO, as outlined in the company bylaws my grandfather wrote. The same bylaws that require a 75% vote to remove me, which you don't have and won't get. Julian's voice was sharp enough to draw blood. If you have concerns about my leadership, Richard, feel free to bring them up at the next board meeting. I'd be happy to show everyone the spreadsheets comparing your division's performance to mine over the last 5 years. I think the numbers speak for themselves. Richard's face flushed red. Catherine touched her son's arm, a warning gesture, and they excused themselves with tight smiles that promised this wasn't over. As soon as they were out of earshot, Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Well, that was terrifying. You were perfect, Julian said, and there was warmth in his voice now, genuine appreciation. The way you handled Catherine's questions, that was brilliant. I just told her the truth. Mostly. You made it sound like a love story instead of a transaction. That's skill. He glanced up at her, and something in his expression made Naomi's heart skip. I'm starting to think I got the better end of this deal. Before Naomi could figure out how to respond to that, a woman's voice called out, Julian West. Is that really you? A stunning blonde in a red dress approached, her smile wide and practiced. She was the kind of beautiful that looked expensive. Perfect skin, perfect hair, perfect everything. The kind of woman who belonged in Julian's world. Vanessa, Julian said, and his voice went carefully neutral. It's been a while. 18 months, Vanessa said, her eyes flickering to his wheelchair and away again, like she couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge it. I heard about the accident, of course. I wanted to reach out, but... She trailed off, her meaning clear. But I didn't want to deal with your broken body and shattered life. This is my wife, Naomi, Julian said, and Naomi heard the edge in his voice. Vanessa's perfectly made-up face showed genuine shock. Your wife. But I thought... we were. She looked at Naomi as if seeing her for the first time. When did this happen? Recently, Julian said shortly. Naomi, this is Vanessa Hartford. We used to know each other. Used to know each other. The phrase was deliberately vague, but Naomi could read between the lines. This was someone from Julian's before the accident, before the wheelchair, before his entire life shattered. Someone who'd walked away when things got difficult. It's lovely to meet you, Naomi said, though it absolutely wasn't. Vanessa's gaze traveled between them, calculating. Well, I suppose congratulations are in order. Though I have to admit, Julian, this seems fast. Are you sure you're thinking clearly? After everything you've been through. My thinking is perfectly clear, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Clearer than it's been in a long time, actually. The accident had a way of showing me who actually matters. Who stayed, and who couldn't wait to run. Vanessa's face paled. That's not fair. You pushed everyone away. You wouldn't return calls, wouldn't see visitors. I was in a hospital bed learning to catheterize myself, Julian said flatly. Forgive me if I wasn't in the mood for social calls. The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away without another word, her red dress a blur of color disappearing into the crowd. Naomi felt Julian's entire body go rigid beneath her hand. His breathing had gone shallow, and when she looked down at his face, she saw something close to anguish in his eyes before he masked it. Julian. I need some air, he said tightly, already wheeling himself toward the balcony doors. Naomi followed without asking permission, because something in his voice told her that leaving him alone right now would be a mistake. She found him outside on the terrace, staring out at the Chicago skyline with an expression that looked like it might crack him open. "That was Vanessa Hartford," he said without turning around. "We were engaged. I was going to propose the week after the accident." Naomi's chest tightened. "Julian. She visited me exactly twice in the hospital. The first time, she cried and held my hand and promised nothing would change. The second time, she told me she couldn't do this, couldn't watch me struggle, couldn't deal with the reality of what my life had become. She left her engagement ring on my bedside table and walked out." His laugh was bitter. "I hadn't bought the ring yet, but she'd already picked one out. Diamond, platinum, the works. She left it anyway. Like she was returning something that didn't fit." "I'm sorry," Naomi said quietly, moving to stand beside his wheelchair. "Don't be. She did me a favor. Showed me exactly what I was worth once the illusion of perfection shattered." He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was raw and unguarded. "That's why I wanted this arrangement with you. No illusions. No expectations. Just honest transaction. At least then I know where I stand." Naomi's heart was breaking for him, this brilliant, damaged man who'd wrapped himself in contracts and cold business terms because he couldn't bear to be vulnerable again. Who'd convinced himself that being alone was safer than risking another abandonment. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. Julian startled at the contact, his gaze dropping to their intertwined fingers. His hand was warm, his grip surprisingly strong, and Naomi felt something shift in the space between them. Something that had nothing to do with their contract and everything to do with the simple human need for connection. "You're worth more than you think," she said softly. "The wheelchair doesn't change that. The accident doesn't change that. You're still the man who runs a $40 billion company, who's brilliant enough to destroy Richard in 30 seconds of conversation, who works 18-hour days because you refuse to let anything defeat you. That's who you are. Not what happened to you." Julian stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "Why are you being kind to me? You don't have to. That's not in the contract. Maybe I'm starting to think there are more important things than the contract." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to examine. Naomi realized she was still holding his hand, her thumb tracing small circles against his palm without conscious thought. The touch felt intimate in a way that made her breath catch. Julian's gaze dropped to her lips, and for one wild, impossible moment, Naomi thought he might kiss her. Actually kiss her, not the perfunctory press of lips they'd exchanged at their wedding, but something real and raw and desperately honest. Then the balcony doors opened, and the moment shattered. "There you are." Patricia appeared, looking harried. "Julian, the mayor wants to speak with you about the education initiative. And Naomi, there's a photographer from Chicago Magazine who wants a picture of the happy couple." Julian's expression shuttered immediately, all that vulnerability vanishing behind his careful mask. But he didn't let go of Naomi's hand. Not right away. His fingers tightened around hers for just a second, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted between them tonight. "Duty calls," he said, his voice back to its usual controlled tone. They returned to the ballroom, played their parts perfectly, smiled for cameras and made small talk with people whose names Naomi immediately forgot. But all night, she found herself acutely aware of Julian beside her. The way his hand would occasionally brush her arm when they moved through the crowd, the protective edge in his voice when men looked at her a little too long, the way his gaze would find hers across the room like he was making sure she was okay. And when they finally returned to the penthouse at 2 in the morning, exhausted and drained, Julian wheeled himself to his bedroom door and paused. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For tonight. For..." He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "For making it easier. That's what wives do," Naomi said, aiming for lightness. "Is it?" His gray eyes searched her face. "Even the ones who are only here for the money?" The question felt like a test, like he was trying to figure out where they stood now that the carefully drawn boundaries of their arrangement had started to blur. Naomi didn't have a good answer, didn't know how to explain that somewhere between the chicken marsala and holding his hand on the balcony, she'd started to see Julian West as more than just a means to an end. "Get some rest," she said instead. "You look exhausted." He nodded slowly, disappointment flickering across his features before he could hide it. "Good night, Naomi." "Good night, Julian." She watched him wheel himself into his room and close the door, and only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth that had been building all night. She was starting to care about him. Really care. Not because of the money or the contract, but because Julian West, broken, brilliant, guarded Julian West, was getting under her skin in ways she'd never anticipated. And that terrified her more than anything. The next morning, Naomi woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on her nightstand. She grabbed it groggily, squinting at the screen through sleep-blurred eyes. It was her mother's nurse. At 6 a.m. Her heart dropped into her stomach as she answered. "Hello." "Naomi, don't panic," the nurse said immediately, which of course made Naomi's panic spike to catastrophic levels. "Your mother is stable, but she had a reaction to the treatment last night. We had to move her to the ICU for monitoring." The world tilted sideways. What kind of reaction? Is she? She's breathing on her own, and her vitals are improving. But the doctors want to keep her under observation for the next 48 hours. It's a precaution. Naomi was already out of bed, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. "I'm coming right now. Tell her I'm coming." She ended the call and stumbled into the hallway, her mind a white noise of terror. Her mother. ICU. Reaction to treatment. The words circled like vultures, each one stripping away another piece of the fragile hope she'd been clinging to. The money was supposed to fix this. The treatment was supposed to save her. What if it wasn't enough? Naomi. She looked up to find Julian wheeling himself toward her, concern etched into his features. He was already dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, like he'd been awake for hours, but his hair was still slightly mussed from sleep. "My mother," she said, her voice cracking on the words. "She's in the ICU. I have to go. I have to." "I'll drive you," Julian said immediately. "You can't drive. Your wheelchair." "My driver, Robert, can be here in 10 minutes. But you're not going alone." His voice left no room for argument. "Get your things. I'll call ahead to let the hospital know we're coming." Naomi wanted to argue, wanted to say she could handle this herself, that he didn't need to disrupt his day for her family emergency. But the words wouldn't come, and honestly, she was grateful not to face this alone. "Thank you," she whispered. Julian's expression softened. "That's what husbands do. Even the ones who are only here for the money." He was throwing her own words back at her, but gently, a reminder that maybe they were both starting to be more to each other than their contract specified. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Naomi sat in the ICU waiting room, her knee bouncing with barely contained anxiety while Julian sat beside her in his wheelchair, his presence a steady anchor in her spiraling thoughts. 2 hours had passed since they'd arrived. 2 hours of waiting while doctors ran tests and nurses hurried in and out of her mother's room with expressions that gave nothing away. "She has to be okay," Naomi said for what felt like the 100th time. "The treatment was supposed to work. We did everything right." "Hey." Julian reached over and took her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "This isn't on you. You got her the best possible care. Sometimes bodies just react unpredictably. It doesn't mean the treatment won't work." "You don't know that." "No," he agreed quietly. "But I know that torturing yourself with worst-case scenarios won't help her or you." Naomi looked at their joined hands, his pale fingers intertwined with her darker ones, the contrast somehow beautiful. When had this become natural? When had Julian West's touch started to feel like comfort instead of contractual obligation? "Why are you here?" she asked softly. "You could be at the office." You have a company to run. The company can wait. You can't. The simple statement hit her harder than any grand declaration could have. Because Julian wasn't a man who made grand gestures or spoke in flowery language. He showed up. He stayed. And right now, when Naomi felt like she was drowning, his presence was the only thing keeping her head above water. Ms. Clark West. They both looked up. A doctor in blue scrubs stood in the doorway, her expression neutral but not grim. Naomi's heart hammered so hard she could barely hear over the rush of blood in her ears. Your mother is stable, the doctor said, and Naomi's entire body sagged with relief. The reaction was severe, but we've got it under control. We'll need to adjust her treatment protocol, but the preliminary tests show the therapy is actually working. The tumor has shrunk by nearly 15%. It's working. Naomi's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. It's working. We're cautiously optimistic. The doctor smiled. She's asking for you, if you'd like to see her. Naomi stood on trembling legs, then hesitated and looked back at Julian. Would you come with me? Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, warmth, something that looked almost like tenderness. Are you sure? I'm sure. They followed the doctor down the sterile hallway to her mother's room. Patricia Clark lay in the hospital bed looking small and fragile, for lines running into her arms, monitors beeping softly around her. But when she saw Naomi, her face lit up with a smile that made her look more like herself than she had in months. Baby girl, she said, her voice weak but steady. You didn't have to come all this way. Of course I did. You scared me half to death. Naomi moved to her bedside, taking her mother's hand carefully to avoid the four. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, but alive. Patricia's gaze moved past Naomi to where Julian sat in his wheelchair near the door. And who is this handsome man you've brought with you? Naomi's throat tightened. In all the chaos of the past few weeks, she'd told her mother about the marriage but hadn't had a chance to introduce them. Mama, this is Julian. My husband. She still stumbled over the word, because it felt too big, too real, too weighted with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Patricia's eyes widened, then softened with understanding. So you're the reason my daughter has been able to afford this fancy treatment. Come closer, Julian West. Let me get a look at the man who saved my life. Julian wheeled himself closer to the bed, and Naomi saw vulnerability flash across his face, like he was preparing to be judged and found wanting. But Patricia just studied him with the same sharp, assessing gaze she'd used when Naomi was a teenager bringing boys home. You love my daughter? Patricia asked bluntly. Julian's gaze flickered to Naomi, and something passed between them. A question, a possibility, a truth neither of them was ready to speak out loud. I'm starting to, he said quietly. The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Her breath caught, her heart stuttered, and suddenly the hospital room felt too small to contain everything she was feeling. Julian West, careful, guarded, broken Julian West, had just admitted he was falling for her. In front of her mother. In a hospital room. With complete, devastating honesty. Good, Patricia said, satisfaction in her voice. Because my daughter deserves someone who sees her worth. Someone who shows up when things get hard. She squeezed Naomi's hand. And baby girl, you better not mess this up. A man who'll sit in a hospital waiting room for 2 hours for a woman's mother is a man worth keeping. Mama. I'm serious. I didn't raise you to be stupid about love. Naomi felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by relief and terror and something dangerously close to hope. Because her mother was going to be okay. The treatment was working. And Julian West had just cracked open his carefully guarded heart and let her see what was inside. And God help her, she was falling too. Julian just admitted he's starting to fall for Naomi. Do you think she feels the same way? Or is she still thinking of this as just a business arrangement? Let me know in the comments what you think happens next. They stayed at the hospital for another 3 hours while Patricia rested and the doctors finalized her new treatment schedule. Julian made calls to his office from the waiting room, managing West Industries remotely while Naomi sat with her mother, holding her hand and watching her sleep. When they finally left, the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Robert drove them home in silence, and Naomi stared out the window, her mind replaying Julian's words on an endless loop. I'm starting to love her. Starting to see this as something more than a contract. Starting to let himself be vulnerable again. The penthouse felt different when they returned, less like a museum and more like a home they were building together, brick by brick, vulnerability by vulnerability. Julian wheeled himself toward his office, probably planning to work through the evening to make up for lost time. Julian! Naomi called after him. He stopped, turning to look at her with an expression that was carefully neutral. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the wariness in his eyes. He was waiting for her to address what he'd said at the hospital, and he was terrified of what she might say. Thank you, she said softly. For today. For being there. For. She trailed off, searching for words big enough to contain everything she felt. For being you. Something in his expression cracked. Naomi. I know this is complicated, she said quickly, before she lost her nerve. I know we started this as a transaction, and I know I signed up for money, not feelings. But somewhere between the galas and the chicken marsala and watching you destroy your cousin with spreadsheets, I've started to see you. The real you. And I like what I see, Julian. I like it a lot. He was staring at her like she'd just told him the sky was green. You don't have to say that. What I said at the hospital, I shouldn't have put that on you. This is already complicated enough without. I'm not saying it because I have to, Naomi interrupted, crossing the space between them. She knelt in front of his wheelchair, taking both his hands in hers. I'm saying it because it's true. You're brilliant and kind and stronger than you give yourself credit for. And yes, maybe I married you for money. But that's not why I'm staying. Julian's breath caught. His hands tightened around hers, and she could see his throat work as he tried to find words. What are you saying? I'm saying I want this to be real. Not just for the cameras, not just for the contract. Real. If you want that too. For a long moment, Julian just stared at her, his eyes searching her face like he was looking for the lie, the trick, the inevitable betrayal. But Naomi held his gaze steady, letting him see everything, the truth, the fear, the hope. Finally, slowly, Julian leaned forward. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that made her heart ache. I want that, he whispered. God help me, I want that more than anything. Then he kissed her. Not like their wedding kiss, perfunctory and meaningless. This kiss was real and desperate and full of all the things they'd been too afraid to say out loud. His lips moved against hers with a hunger that stole her breath, and Naomi kissed him back just as desperately, her hands sliding into his hair, anchoring herself to him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers. I'm terrified, he admitted quietly. Of wanting this. Of needing you. Of what happens if I lose you too. You're not going to lose me, Naomi said fiercely. I'm not Vanessa. I'm not going to run when things get hard. I'm here, Julian. I'm staying. Promise me. I promise. He kissed her again, softer this time, like he was sealing the promise between them. And when he finally pulled back, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like peace. Come to physical therapy with me tomorrow, he said suddenly. I've been doing sessions 3 times a week with a specialist. Dr. Kim. She's the best in the country for spinal cord injuries. Naomi blinked at the sudden subject change. You want me there? I want you to see what I'm dealing with. The reality of it, without any filters. If we're doing this, if we're really doing this, then you need to know what you're signing up for. I already know, Julian. You know the surface. You don't know the details. The pain, the limitations, the things I can't do anymore. His voice dropped. I need you to see all of it before you make any promises you might regret. Naomi understood what he was really saying. I need to know you'll still want me when you see how broken I really am. Okay, she said simply. I'll come with you. Relief flooded his features. Okay. They stayed like that for a while, Naomi kneeling in front of his wheelchair, Julian's hands still cradling her face, and let themselves exist in this new reality they'd created. A reality where their contract marriage was becoming something neither of them had planned for but both of them desperately wanted. Something real. Something worth fighting for. Something that might actually save them both. Dr. Kim's physical therapy clinic occupied the top floor of a medical building in downtown Chicago, all floor-to-ceiling windows and state-of-the-art equipment that probably cost more than most people's houses. Naomi followed Julian through the doors the next morning, her stomach tight with nerves she couldn't quite name. This felt important. Like crossing a threshold into a part of Julian's life he'd kept carefully hidden from everyone, including her. Mr. West. A petite Korean woman in her 40s approached with a warm smile, her athletic build suggesting she could probably bench press twice her weight. Right on time, as always. And you've brought a guest. My wife, Naomi, Julian said, and Naomi heard the slight emphasis on the word, like he was still getting used to it meaning something real. Naomi, this is Dr. Susan Kim. She's been torturing me 3 times a week for the past year. I prefer encouraging your recovery through evidence-based therapeutic intervention, Dr. Kim said dryly. But torture works too. She extended her hand to Naomi. It's wonderful to meet you. Julian's mentioned you. He has. Naomi glanced at Julian, who suddenly seemed very interested in adjusting his wheelchair's armrest. Just that you're studying physical therapy. That's excellent. It means you'll understand what we're working with here. Dr. Kim gestured toward the therapy area. Shall we get started? Fair warning, Mrs. West. This isn't going to be pretty. Julian pushes himself hard, and recovery from a spinal cord injury is brutal work. I can handle it, Naomi said, though her heart was hammering. What she wasn't prepared for was watching Julian transfer from his wheelchair to the therapy table, a process that involved upper body strength she hadn't realized he possessed and a level of pain he'd been hiding from her. She saw it in the tight lines around his mouth, the way his jaw clenched, the sharp breath he took when his weight shifted wrong. Talk me through your pain level, Dr. Kim said, starting with range of motion exercises on Julian's legs. 1 to 10. 6, Julian said through gritted teeth. Liar. Try again. 8. Dr. Kim's hands moved with clinical precision, manipulating Julian's legs through stretches that made the muscles in his arms cord with tension as he gripped the table. Naomi watched, her chest tight, as Dr. Kim explained the extent of his injury. The L1 vertebra, the incomplete spinal cord damage, the nerve pain that was constant and unrelenting. The good news is Julian has an incomplete injury, Dr. Kim said, moving to test sensation in his legs with what looked like a small pinwheel. He has some feeling below the injury site, which means there's potential for recovery. The bad news is that potential doesn't guarantee results. We've been working on strengthening his core, maintaining muscle mass, and exploring every possible avenue for regaining function. What about experimental treatments? Naomi asked, unable to stay silent. Stem cells, neural regeneration, nerve transplants. We've explored everything, Julian said flatly. 6 surgeries, countless treatments, enough experimental procedures to fill a medical journal. Nothing's worked. But Naomi heard something in his voice, not quite defeat, but exhaustion. Like he'd been fighting this battle for so long that he'd forgotten what victory might look like. Tell me about the nerve pain, Naomi said, moving closer. You mentioned it's constant. Dr. Kim nodded. Neuropathic pain is common with spinal cord injuries. For Julian, it manifests as burning sensations, shooting pains, and general discomfort that medication can only partially manage. It's one of the hardest aspects of his recovery, not the paralysis itself, but the pain that comes with it. Naomi watched as Dr. Kim continued the session, putting Julian through exercises that left him sweating and shaking. But what struck her most wasn't the physical difficulty, it was the way Julian pushed through it with grim determination, never complaining, never asking for breaks even when she could see he was in agony. This was what he dealt with every single day. This pain, this struggle, this constant battle against a body that had betrayed him. And he'd been facing it completely alone. After the session, Julian transferred back to his wheelchair with movements that were smoother than before but still clearly painful. Dr. Kim handed him a towel and a water bottle, her expression a mix of professional assessment and genuine concern. "You're pushing too hard again," she said. "I can see it in your muscle tension. You need to take rest days seriously, Julian." "I'll rest when I'm dead," Julian muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Or you'll end up with a repetitive stress injury that sets your recovery back 6 months. Your choice." Dr. Kim turned to Naomi. "Maybe you can talk some sense into him. He doesn't listen to me." "I'll try," Naomi said, though she suspected getting Julian to slow down would be like asking a hurricane to take a break. They were halfway to the elevator when Dr. Kim called out, "Mrs. West? Could I speak with you for a moment? Privately?" Naomi glanced at Julian, who nodded. "I'll meet you downstairs." She followed Dr. Kim back into the clinic, her stomach knotting with apprehension. The doctor's expression had gone serious in a way that made Naomi's instincts scream that something was wrong. "I wanted to talk to you about Julian's prognosis," Dr. Kim said, closing the door to her office. "He won't discuss this with anyone, but since you're his wife and studying PT yourself, I thought you should know the full picture." "What is it?" Dr. Kim pulled up a file on her computer, scans of Julian's spine, surgical reports, treatment histories. "Julian's injury is unique. The L1 fracture caused incomplete damage to the spinal cord, which means some nerve pathways are still intact. Most specialists looked at his case and said recovery was impossible, but I disagree." Naomi's heart leaped. "You think he can walk again?" "I think there's a possibility. A small one, but real." Dr. Kim pointed to the scans. "There's a procedure being developed at Johns Hopkins, a combination of stem cell therapy, nerve bridge grafting, and intensive neural rehabilitation. It's still in clinical trials, but the early results are promising. 20% of patients with injuries similar to Julian's have regained partial to full mobility." 20%, Naomi breathed. "That's not a guarantee. And the procedure is incredibly risky. Major surgery, months of recovery, no promises. But it's a chance." Dr. Kim's expression softened. "I've been trying to convince Julian to consider it for 6 months. He refuses to even look at the research." "Why?" "Because he's terrified of hoping. He's already been through so many failed treatments, so many promises that led nowhere. I think he's decided it's easier to accept his limitations than risk another devastating disappointment." Dr. Kim met Naomi's eyes. "But he might listen to you. If you can convince him that taking this chance is worth the risk, that you'll be there regardless of the outcome, it might make the difference." Naomi's mind was racing. A chance for Julian to walk again. A real, tangible possibility that he could reclaim the life the accident had stolen from him. But also a risk. Another surgery, another potential failure, another opportunity for his hope to be crushed. "I'll talk to him," Naomi said quietly. "But Dr. Kim, what happens if the procedure doesn't work? What does that do to him psychologically?" "Honestly, it could break him." Dr. Kim's voice was gentle but unflinching. "Or it could give him closure, the knowledge that he tried everything possible. Right now, he's stuck in this limbo of, what if? Sometimes knowing for certain, even if the answer isn't what we want, brings its own kind of peace." Naomi thanked Dr. Kim and made her way to the elevator, her thoughts a tangled mess of hope and fear. She found Julian waiting in the lobby, scrolling through emails on his phone with that familiar intensity that said he was already back in work mode. "Everything okay?" he asked when she approached. "Fine. Dr. Kim just wanted to discuss some treatment options." Julian's expression shuttered immediately. "I've tried every treatment option. There's nothing left. What if there was? There isn't, Naomi. Trust me, I've spent 18 months and millions of dollars learning that lesson. His voice was sharp, defensive. I know you're studying PT and you want to help, but this isn't something that can be fixed. I've accepted that. You should too. The words stung, but Naomi understood what was really happening. Julian was protecting himself. Building walls before she could dangle hope in front of him like a carrot he'd never be able to reach. Okay, she said simply, deciding to let it go for now. Let's go home. The tension followed them back to the penthouse like a third passenger in the car. Julian disappeared into his office immediately, his body language screaming that he wanted to be left alone. But Naomi couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Kim's words, about the possibility of recovery that Julian was too scared to even consider. She spent the afternoon researching the Johns Hopkins procedure, pulling up medical journals and clinical trial data, her heart pounding as she read through case studies. Dr. Kim was right, the success rate wasn't high, but it wasn't zero either. And for someone like Julian, who'd tried everything else, it might be worth the risk. But how did she convince a man who'd been disappointed so many times that it was worth hoping again? She was still wrestling with that question when her phone rang. Patricia's nurse. Naomi, your mother is asking for you. She's being discharged tomorrow, and she wants to discuss her ongoing care plan. Relief flooded through her. Discharged meant stable, meant the treatment was working, meant her mother was going to be okay. I'll be there in an hour, Naomi said. She found Julian in his office, surrounded by monitors displaying financial data that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all Naomi understood. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. I'm going to the hospital, she said from the doorway. My mom's being discharged tomorrow. I'll probably be gone a few hours. Julian looked up, and some of the tension in his expression eased. That's great news. Do you want me to come with you? You don't have to. I know you're busy. Naomi. He wheeled himself closer. I want to be there. For you, and for your mother. Something warm bloomed in Naomi's chest. This was why she was falling for him. Not the money or the penthouse or the designer clothes, but moments like this when Julian showed her exactly who he was beneath the armor. A man who showed up, who cared, who made space for the people he loved even when his own world was falling apart. Thank you, she said softly. They drove to the hospital together, and this time when they walked into Patricia's room, her mother was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had in months. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes had that familiar spark Naomi hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. Look at my daughter, bringing her handsome husband to visit me again, Patricia said, her smile wide. You two are going to make me believe in love if you keep this up. Julian wheeled himself closer to the bed. How are you feeling, Mrs. Clark? Like I might actually live to see my grandchildren. Which means you two better get started on that project soon. Mama. Naomi felt heat flood her cheeks. But Patricia just laughed, the sound rich and familiar and so beautifully alive that Naomi felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she'd been fighting for. This moment, this laughter, this proof that her mother was going to survive. The doctors say the treatment is working even better than expected, Patricia said, her expression softening. The tumor is shrinking. They're cautiously optimistic about long-term remission. She reached for Naomi's hand. Baby girl, you saved my life. You and Julian both. It was the treatment. It was you. You found a way when there was no way. You married a stranger to give me a chance at life. Patricia's eyes were wet. I know what this cost you, Naomi. I know the sacrifice you made. Naomi glanced at Julian, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't a sacrifice, Mama. Not anymore. Patricia smiled knowingly. I can see that. The way you two look at each other, that's not pretend. That's real. After they finalized the discharge plans and said their goodbyes, Julian was quiet on the drive home. Naomi could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the car, but she didn't push. She was learning that Julian needed time to process, to sort through his emotions before he could articulate them. It wasn't until they were back in the penthouse, standing in the kitchen while Naomi made tea neither of them would drink, that he finally spoke. "Your mother almost died," he said quietly. "And you saved her by marrying me." "Julian, let me finish." He wheeled himself closer, his gray eyes intense. "You made this impossible choice. Marry a stranger, tie yourself to a broken man, give up 2 years of your life, because you love your mother that much. Because you'd do anything to save her." "Of course I would. She's my mother. And that's who you are. Someone who fights for the people you love, no matter the cost." His voice dropped. "Dr. Kim told you about the Johns Hopkins procedure, didn't she?" Naomi's breath caught. "How did you?" "I know Susan. I know how her mind works. She's been trying to convince me to consider it for months, and now she's recruited you to her cause." There was no anger in his voice, just weary resignation. "She showed you the research, told you about the success rates, made it sound like hope is still possible." "It is possible, Julian. 20%. 20% means 80% failure," he interrupted. 80% chance of another surgery that doesn't work, another recovery that leads nowhere, another false promise that shatters when reality hits. "But what if you're in the 20%? And what if I'm not?" His voice rose, frustration bleeding through. "What if I go through months of surgery and recovery and pain, and I'm still in this chair? What if I let myself hope again, and it destroys me?" Naomi set down her tea and moved to kneel in front of his wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. "Then I'll be there to catch you when you fall. That's what you don't seem to understand, Julian. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to face this by yourself." "You say that now," he said bitterly. "But you didn't sign up for this. You signed up for 2 years and $5 million, not a lifetime of taking care of an invalid." "Don't call yourself that." Naomi's voice was sharp. "You're not an invalid. You're a brilliant, capable man who happens to use a wheelchair. And I didn't sign up for this arrangement expecting to fall in love with you, but here we are." The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and undeniable. Julian stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. "You, what?" "I'm in love with you," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I didn't plan it, I didn't expect it, but it's true. I love you, Julian West. Not your money, not your penthouse, not the contract. You." "Naomi, let me finish." She squeezed his hands. "I love how brilliant you are, how you destroy your enemies with spreadsheets and dry humor. I love how you work 18-hour days because you refuse to let anything defeat you. I love the way you show up for the people you care about, even when you're exhausted and in pain. I love that you came to the hospital with me, twice, because you knew I needed you there." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. "And I love you enough to tell you the truth. You're terrified of hoping because you've been hurt so badly. But Julian, hope is the only thing that's going to get you through this. Hope and love and the knowledge that no matter what happens with that surgery, whether it works or doesn't, I will be here. I will stay. Because this isn't about the contract anymore. This is about us." Julian was crying too, she realized. Silent tears tracking down his cheeks as he stared at her like she'd just offered him something he'd forgotten existed, a future. A real one, not defined by his injury or his limitations, but by the possibility that he might actually be loved for who he was, wheelchair and all. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to let someone in again." "Then let me show you." Naomi stood and wrapped her arms around him, feeling his body shake with the force of emotions he'd been holding back for so long. "Let me love you. Let yourself believe that you're worth loving. And maybe, just maybe, let yourself hope that there might be a future where you walk again. Not because you need to for me to love you, but because you deserve every chance at healing." Julian's arms came around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her shoulder, and she felt the wetness of his tears against her skin. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm so fucking scared, Naomi." "I know. Me too. But we'll be scared together." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other in the middle of the kitchen, two broken people learning how to be whole again through the simple act of holding on. Naomi just told Julian she loves him and wants him to try the experimental surgery. "Do you think he'll take the risk? What would you do in his position? Play it safe or take a chance on hope? Let me know in the comments." The next 2 weeks brought a shift in the penthouse that Naomi felt in her bones. Julian started smiling more, real smiles that reached his eyes and transformed his face from handsome to devastating. They had dinner together every night, not because the contract required it, but because they genuinely wanted to. Julian would tell her about boardroom battles and corporate strategies, and Naomi would share stories from her online classes and updates about her mother's recovery. They talked about everything: childhoods and dreams, fears and failures, the people they'd been before life knocked them sideways. Naomi learned that Julian had wanted to be an architect before his father died and left him a company to run. Julian learned that Naomi had always wanted to dance professionally until an injury in college ended that dream and led her to physical therapy instead. "We're both living lives we didn't choose," Julian said one night over Chef Raymond's Coq au vin. "Maybe," Naomi agreed. "Or maybe we're exactly where we're supposed to be." They hadn't discussed the Johns Hopkins procedure again, and Naomi was careful not to push. But she left research articles on the kitchen counter, pulled up success stories on her laptop when Julian was nearby, planted seeds of hope without forcing them to grow. She was learning that loving Julian West meant understanding his fear, respecting his boundaries, and trusting that he'd make the right choice when he was ready. But then Richard West made his move, and everything changed. Naomi was in the penthouse kitchen when Patricia called, her voice tight with urgency. "Turn on Channel 7. Now." Naomi grabbed the remote and flipped on the TV. Her stomach dropped. Richard West stood at a podium, surrounded by reporters and camera flashes. The chiron at the bottom of the screen read, "West Industries CEO Fitness questioned by board member." "My cousin Julian is a brilliant businessman," Richard was saying, his voice dripping with false concern. "But recent events have called into question his ability to lead West Industries effectively. His sudden marriage to a woman he barely knew, his isolation from board members, his refusal to consider stepping aside for additional leadership support, these are all warning signs that Julian may not be in the right headspace to handle the demands of a $40 billion company." "That son of a bitch," Naomi breathed. "Furthermore," Richard continued, "I've called for an emergency board meeting next month to discuss potential leadership restructuring. It's time we put the company's interests ahead of family loyalty." The screen cut to footage of Naomi and Julian at the charity gala, him in his wheelchair, her standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder. The reporter's voiceover was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Julian's marriage was a desperate attempt to appear stable, and Richard was positioning himself to take over. Naomi heard the whir of Julian's wheelchair behind her and turned to find him staring at the TV, his face pale and his jaw tight. "He's making his play," Julian said flatly. "I knew it was coming, but I didn't expect this. What do we do?" "We." Julian's laugh was bitter. "There is no we in this, Naomi. This is my company, my family, my problem. I'll handle it." "Julian, I need to make some calls." He wheeled himself toward his office, and Naomi saw the walls slamming back into place, brick by brick. The vulnerability he'd shown her over the past 2 weeks was disappearing behind the armor he wore to survive. She wanted to follow him, to argue, to remind him that they were a team now. But she also understood that some battles Julian needed to face alone first, before he could accept help. So she let him go and turned back to the TV, watching as Richard West smiled for the cameras and systematically dismantled everything Julian had built. The next 3 days were brutal. Julian worked around the clock, making calls to board members, strategizing with lawyers, preparing for the emergency meeting that would determine whether he kept control of his company. Naomi barely saw him except in passing, exhausted glimpses of a man pushing himself past every reasonable limit. She tried to help, bringing him food he didn't eat, reminding him to take his pain medication, suggesting he rest. But Julian was locked in survival mode, and nothing she said seemed to penetrate the wall he'd built around himself. On the fourth day, she found him passed out at his desk at 3 a.m, his head resting on his keyboard, prescription bottles scattered across the surface. Her heart lurched. Julian. She shook his shoulder gently. Julian, wake up. He stirred, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot. What time is it? 3 a.m. You need to sleep. Actual sleep, in an actual bed. Can't. Board meeting prep. We'll still be there tomorrow. Come on. She started to help him transfer to his wheelchair, but he pulled away. I can do it myself. I know you can. But you don't have to. Something in his expression cracked. Yes, I do. Because if Richard wins, if I lose the company, then what am I? Just a man in a wheelchair with nothing left to prove he's worth anything. That's not true. Isn't it? Julian's voice rose, sharp with exhaustion and pain. Everything I am is tied to West Industries. My identity, my purpose, my value. Without it, I'm just... He stopped, his jaw working. I'm just broken. And maybe Richard's right. Maybe I'm not fit to lead anymore. Don't say that. Naomi moved in front of his wheelchair, forcing him to look at her. Julian West, you are more than your company. You're brilliant and kind and strong. I'm in a wheelchair, Naomi. I can't even walk across a room. How am I supposed to command respect in a boardroom when I can barely command my own body? The words hung between them like shattered glass. This was Julian's deepest fear, laid bare, that his injury had stolen not just his mobility, but his worth. Your wheelchair doesn't define you, Naomi said fiercely. Your mind does. Your determination does. Your refusal to give up, even when everything seems impossible, does. That's what makes you who you are. Not whether you can walk. You say that now. But Richard is going to stand in front of that board and paint me as weak, unstable, unfit. And they're going to believe him because look at me. I'm exactly what he'll say I am. No, you're not. Naomi's voice was shaking now. You're a man who's built a $40 billion empire while dealing with constant pain. You're a man who shows up for the people he loves even when he's exhausted. You're a man who's fighting battles no one else can see and still winning. She paused. But you can't keep doing this alone, Julian. You're going to break yourself trying to be invincible. What choice do I have? You have me. She took his hands, holding them tight. Let me help you. Let me be your partner in this, not just your wife on paper. We can fight Richard together. We can show the board that you're stronger than ever, not despite the wheelchair, but because you've overcome obstacles they can't even imagine. Julian stared at her, and Naomi watched emotions flicker across his face. Hope, fear, longing, resistance. He was so close to letting her in, to accepting that he didn't have to carry this burden alone. And the Johns Hopkins procedure? He asked quietly. Is that part of your plan too? Fix me so I can walk into that boardroom on my own 2 feet and prove everyone wrong. No. Naomi's voice was firm. The procedure is about giving you options, not fixing you. You don't need fixing, Julian. You need support, love, and maybe a chance at reducing the pain you live with every day. Whether you walk again or not doesn't change who you are or how I feel about you. Julian's eyes were wet. How do you do that? Do what? Make me believe that I might actually be worth loving. Because you are. And I'm going to keep telling you that until you finally believe it. This time when she helped him to his bedroom, he didn't pull away. He let her support him through the transfer from wheelchair to bed, let her remove his shoes and cover him with blankets. And when she turned to leave, his hand caught hers. Stay, he whispered. Please. Naomi had been sleeping in her own room since their wedding night, maintaining the boundaries their contract had established. But those boundaries felt meaningless now, arbitrary lines drawn before they'd known what they were to each other. She climbed into bed beside him, and Julian immediately pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. She felt the tension slowly drain from his body as exhaustion finally claimed him. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, barely audible. "I don't know when it happened, but I love you, Naomi Clark West." Naomi's heart swelled so large she thought it might burst. "I love you too," she whispered back. "And we're going to get through this. Together." Julian was already asleep, his breathing evening out, his face finally peaceful. Naomi lay awake beside him, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. Richard West wanted a fight? Fine. He'd get one. But what Richard didn't know was that Julian wasn't alone anymore. He had Naomi. And she was just getting started. Naomi spent the next 2 weeks becoming Julian's secret weapon. She researched every board member, their backgrounds, their loyalties, their pressure points. She attended Julian's strategy sessions, offering fresh perspectives that cut through his exhaustion. And most importantly, she convinced him that his wheelchair wasn't a weakness to hide, but proof of his strength. "Richard wants you to be ashamed," she told him the night before the meeting. "Don't give him that power." The boardroom was designed to intimidate. Mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. 15 board members sat waiting, their expressions carefully neutral. Richard stood at the head of the table, radiating confidence. Julian wheeled in with Naomi beside him, and she saw Richard's surprise that she'd come. Good. Let him underestimate her. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice smooth. "We're here to discuss West Industries' leadership and whether recent events indicate we need a change in direction." Julian's sudden marriage, his isolation, his refusal to delegate, these aren't the actions of a stable CEO. "My marriage," Julian said calmly, "is to a brilliant woman who saved her mother's life through sheer determination. If that's instability, I'll take it." He opened his laptop. "But let's talk numbers instead of gossip. Since my injury 18 months ago, West Industries' stock price has increased 42%. We've acquired 3 major competitors, expanded into 5 new markets, and increased shareholder value by $18 billion. He pulled up slides, every deal he'd closed, every strategic decision he'd made, every win he'd secured while recovering from a life-altering injury. The board members leaned forward, impressed despite themselves. "You've all received Richard's concerns about my fitness to lead," Julian continued. "What you haven't received is context. My injury doesn't affect my mind, my vision, or my ability to run this company. What it does affect is Richard's inheritance timeline." Richard's face flushed. "That's not. Let me finish, cousin." Julian's voice was steel. "Richard has been positioning himself as heir apparent since my father died. My injury was supposed to be his opportunity. Step in while I'm vulnerable, convince the board I'm incompetent, take over the company. Except I didn't become incompetent. I became better." Naomi watched the board members' faces, saw the calculations happening. Julian was giving them permission to see his injury as strength, not weakness. "The question before you," Julian said, "isn't whether I'm fit to lead. The numbers prove I am. The question is whether you're brave enough to back a CEO who happens to use a wheelchair, or whether you'll let ableist assumptions destroy shareholder value." The room was silent. Then Margaret Chen, the board's longest-serving member, spoke. "Julian has tripled my investment since taking over. His injury has made him more focused, not less. I vote to table this discussion indefinitely." One by one, the other board members nodded. Richard's face went pale as his coup crumbled before his eyes. "Meeting adjourned," Julian said quietly. Then he wheeled out of the room, leaving Richard standing alone at the head of the table, defeated. In the car afterward, Naomi squeezed Julian's hand. "You did it. We did it." He pulled her close. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." 2 weeks later, Julian found Naomi in the library, surrounded by medical journals about spinal cord injuries. "Still researching?" he asked. "Always." She looked up. But I'm not going to push anymore. Whatever you decide about Johns Hopkins, I'm with you. Julian wheeled closer, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what Dr. Kim said. About hope being worth the risk. He paused. I called Johns Hopkins yesterday. I'm scheduled for evaluation next month. Naomi's breath caught. Julian. I'm terrified, he admitted. But you're right, I'll never forgive myself if I don't try. And I finally believe that whether it works or not, I'll be okay. Because I have you. She kissed him then, pouring every ounce of love and pride and hope into it. When they pulled apart, both were crying. There's something else, Julian said. Our contract expires in 2 years. But I don't want to wait that long to make this real. He pulled out a small velvet box. Naomi Clark, will you marry me? Actually marry me this time, not for money or contracts, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. The ring was stunning, a simple diamond that caught the light like captured starfire. But what made Naomi's heart soar wasn't the ring. It was the look in Julian's eyes, hope, love, and absolute certainty that they belonged together. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Patricia stood beside Naomi, both of them crying as they watched Julian at the physical therapy center. The Johns Hopkins procedure had been brutal. 2 surgeries, 3 months of intensive rehabilitation, setbacks that nearly broke him. But today, 6 months post-op, Julian was taking his first steps. Dr. Kim supported one side, a walker the other. Julian's face was tight with concentration and pain, but he moved forward. 1 step. 2. 3. That's my son-in-law, Patricia whispered, squeezing Naomi's hand. Julian looked up and found Naomi's eyes. His smile was radiant, transforming his whole face. For you, he mouthed. For us, Naomi mouthed back. It would be months before Julian could walk unaided. The doctors warned he might always need mobility aids, that full recovery wasn't guaranteed. But it didn't matter. They'd fought through the darkness together and found light on the other side. That night, in their penthouse, no longer divided into separate rooms but truly shared, Julian held Naomi close. I never thought I'd have this, he said quietly. A future that wasn't defined by what I'd lost. You have more than a future. You have everything. Naomi kissed him softly. You have your company, your strength, your mother's voice telling you to be brave. And you have me, for as long as you want me. Forever, then, Julian said. I choose forever. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, full of possibility. Inside, 2 people who'd started as strangers bound by a contract had become something far more powerful. Partners, lovers, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Julian West had learned to walk again. But more importantly, he'd learned to hope, to love, to believe that he was worthy of happiness, wheelchair or not. And Naomi Clark West had learned that marrying for money could lead to something priceless, a love that saw past limitations to the extraordinary man beneath. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. Julian and Naomi's journey from contract marriage to real love is complete. What did you think of their story? Which moment made your heart race, the boardroom showdown, Julian's first proposal, or those first steps in physical therapy? Drop a comment and let me know your favorite scene. And if you loved this romance, hit that follow button. I've got more swoon-worthy stories coming your way. 2 hearts.